Fort Worth, 1974. A city of promise. A year of innocence. Carla Walker was the embodiment of both. At 17, she was a daughter, a friend, a scholar, and a cheerleader. Her life was a meticulously drawn blueprint for success. But outside the glittering sphere of the high school dance, a predator was waiting. A predator who would not just shatter her future, but utterly dismantle the peace and trust of an entire community. On the night of February 17, 1974, 17-year-old Carla Walker was leaving a Valentine's dance with her boyfriend. They had stopped at a bowling alley parking lot when suddenly, a man approached their car. Armed and violent, he pistol-whipped Carla's boyfriend before dragging her out of the vehicle. She screamed as she was forced into the night, but in a matter of seconds, she was gone. Despite frantic searches, media attention, and desperate pleas from her family, no solid leads ever surfaced. The abduction left Fort Worth frozen in fear, and Carla's name became a chilling reminder of how quickly innocence could be stolen. Her body was discovered days later, but the identity of her attacker remained a mystery. For 46 years, the case was cold. Generations came and went, detectives retired, and many feared the truth would never be known. But in 2020, investigators revealed a stunning breakthrough. Modern DNA technology had tied evidence from Carla's clothing directly, a man who had lived quietly in the area all along. The arrest left Fort Worth stunned. Neighbors realized the predator had been hiding in plain sight for nearly half a century. Imagine living your whole life believing a nightmare was buried in the past, only to discover the monster never left your community. Could you ever truly feel safe again? Subscribe to this channel for more real-life cold cases that have been solved. Every view, like, and comment keeps these victims' names alive and ensures their stories are not forgotten. Drop your city or country and time you are watching in the comments, and I will create a video on a cold case from your area, because every community has stories that deserve to be told. Carla Walker was born on January 31, 1957, in Fort Worth, Texas. To her friends, she wasn't just another teenager in the crowd. Carla stood out. At 17 years old, she had that glow that comes when someone's life is just beginning to unfold. She was smart, outgoing, and had the kind of smile that made people remember her. She attended Western Hills High School, one of those Texas schools where Friday night football games and homecoming dances carried their own kind of magic. She was deeply involved in school life, active in clubs and social circles, and always described as well-liked. In fact, classmates remembered her as the girl who could fit in anywhere, whether it was joking with cheerleaders, chatting with teachers, or spending quiet moments with close friends. In the early 1970s, Fort Worth was a community where kids like Carla were expected to grow up, fall in love, and build a future not far from home. She had a steady boyfriend, a supportive family, and plans that stretched far beyond the classroom. To everyone around her, she embodied hope, promise, and possibility. But what no one could know then was that this bright, ordinary Texas girl, living a life full of potential, was about to become the center of one of the city's most haunting tragedies. Her name would be spoken for decades, not just as a memory of youth, but as the victim of a crime that would shake Fort Worth to its core. It was the evening of February 17, 1974, a cool Sunday night in Fort Worth, Texas, and for 17-year-old Carla Walker, life felt as close to perfect as a teenager could imagine. Just 2 nights before, she had attended her high school's Valentine's Day dance, a hallmark event at Western Hills High School, where streamers hung from the gym ceiling, and young couples twirled beneath dimmed lights to the slow music of the era. She went with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, the kind of date that everyone expected her to have. He was popular, athletic, and deeply smitten with Carla. Together, they seemed like a snapshot of young American love in the early 1970s. After the dance, like so many teenagers in Fort Worth, they weren't ready to end the night. They climbed into Rodney's car, a safe little bubble away from the crowded dance floor, and drove off. Their destination wasn't unusual: the Ridgelea Bowl bowling alley parking lot, a place where couples went to talk, to laugh, and to share the kind of private moments that only teenagers understand. For Carla and Rodney, it was a simple choice: a quiet place to linger, away from watchful eyes. But what unfolded in that parking lot would shatter not only their lives, but ripple through the entire city of Fort Worth for decades. The moment came suddenly, shattering the fragile sense of teenage safety. As Rodney would later recount, the driver's side door of the car was yanked open with force. A shadow loomed in the dark, and before Rodney had time to register what was happening, a gun barrel cracked against his head. He was pistol-whipped brutally, the blow so fierce that it knocked him nearly unconscious. Rodney remembered only fragments: the dizziness, the metallic taste of blood, the confusion of why this was happening. But above it all, he remembered Carla's scream. The attacker grabbed her, dragging her from the car, ignoring her pleas. In seconds, their perfect Valentine's weekend spiraled into violence. When Rodney regained his senses, Carla was gone. He was left in the car, injured and disoriented, replaying the nightmare in his mind. His high school sweetheart had been taken before his eyes, ripped away in an instant. And in that moment, there was nothing he could do to stop it. News of the abduction spread quickly. For Fort Worth in 1974, this wasn't the kind of crime that people were used to hearing about. Carla wasn't a runaway. She wasn't involved in risky behavior. She was, by all accounts, the kind of girl parents wanted their daughters to be. Law enforcement mobilized almost immediately, and the Walker family was thrown into a panic that no words could capture. Neighbors joined the search. Friends stayed up through the night, hoping, praying that Carla would be found alive. But as hours turned into days, hope began to dim. 3 days later, on February 20th, 1974, Carla's body was discovered. She had been left in a culvert near Benbrook Lake, a lonely stretch of land about 30 minutes outside Fort Worth. The discovery was as brutal as it was heartbreaking. Carla had not simply been killed. She had been tortured. The evidence was clear and harrowing. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. The violence she endured was almost unspeakable. For the detectives who arrived at the scene, hardened men who had seen death before, this was different. This was a cruelty that stood out. The culvert, surrounded by brush and quiet countryside, suddenly became a crime scene that carried the silence of grief. Every officer there knew they were looking at the end of a young life that had barely begun. News of Carla's death spread like wildfire. Fort Worth was stunned, reeling from the brutality of what had happened to one of their own. Parents clutched their children closer. Teenagers who once thought of their city as safe suddenly looked over their shoulders. Carla was the kind of victim that made the story hit harder. She wasn't a stranger on the margins of society. She was the girl next door, a daughter, a friend, a classmate. Her death was proof that violence could reach into the most ordinary of lives. At Western Hills High School, desks sat empty, and whispers filled the hallways. Students cried openly. Teachers, unable to make sense of the horror, tried to comfort kids while struggling with their own grief. For Rodney McCoy, the guilt of that night was unbearable. He had been there. He had seen it, and though he was a victim himself, pistol-whipped and traumatized, the fact that he had survived while Carla hadn't was something he would carry for the rest of his life. Investigators began piecing together the final hours of Carla's life. The brutality was chilling. Her abductor hadn't acted in panic or haste. The torture suggested something deeper, something cruel and deliberate. This wasn't just a killing. It was a sadistic act of control and violence. The autopsy revealed the grim truth. Carla's final hours were filled with unimaginable suffering. And for her family, the details were a burden too heavy to bear. Her parents, once filled with hope that their daughter's bright future would take her far, now had to stand by her grave. The image of Carla, a vibrant teenager in her dance dress just days before, was now forever tied to the image of a victim, her life cut short by a predator. From the moment her body was found, the case became a haunting, cold shadow over Fort Worth. Police vowed justice, but leads were scarce. Witnesses had little to offer, and forensics in 1974 were primitive by today's standards. Still, investigators refused to let go. But as the years passed, the crime itself took on a near-mythical quality in the city. Generations of residents knew Carla's name. Parents told their children about her, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a reminder of innocence lost. For the Walker family, the loss never faded. Holidays were empty. Birthdays passed with a haunting silence. Her absence lingered in every corner of their home. The discovery of Carla Walker's body in February 1974 shook Fort Worth to its core. But as devastating as the crime itself was, the search for answers quickly became its own torment. Detectives now faced a puzzle that would span not just weeks or months, but decades. In the first frantic days after her murder, investigators worked tirelessly. They had a young victim, a brutal crime, and a community demanding justice. But what they didn't have was clarity. Carla's abduction had been brazen, and it had happened in front of a witness, her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. Rodney had been pistol-whipped and left barely conscious, but even through his haze of blood and confusion, he was able to tell police what little he knew. The attacker had carried a .22 caliber pistol, and that detail became the first major thread detectives began to pull. They started knocking on doors, searching for men in the area who not only matched descriptions but also owned weapons of that kind. One name stood out early: Glen Samuel McCurley, a 31-year-old Fort Worth man. On paper, he was ordinary, almost forgettable. A working-class husband, a man who blended into the crowd. But he owned a .22 pistol, the very type believed to have been used in Carla's abduction. Detectives sat down with McCurley in 1974. They asked him about the night of the murder, about his gun, about his movements. He answered politely, even coolly. He denied any involvement, insisting he had nothing to do with the girl's disappearance. When asked about the pistol, McCurley admitted he'd owned one but claimed it had been stolen from his car. It wasn't impossible. Guns did go missing. Cars were broken into all the time, and with no fingerprints, no witnesses pointing directly to him, and no way to connect him forensically, investigators had nothing concrete. McCurley walked away from that interview a free man, his name written in the file but not pressed further. At the time, that was the limit of police tools. DNA testing didn't exist. Forensics were crude. Detectives had to rely on eyewitness accounts, confessions, and lucky breaks, none of which came. Weeks turned to months, and the case files grew thicker, not with answers, but with dead ends. Leads would flare up only to fizzle. Other men were questioned. Rumors circulated. False confessions surfaced, as they so often do in high-profile cases, only muddying the waters. But every time investigators thought they were closing in, the evidence dissolved in their hands. By the end of the 1970s, Carla Walker's murder had slipped from headlines into whispers. People still remembered, of course. In Fort Worth, Carla's name lingered like a ghost. Parents used her story as a warning to their daughters. Teenagers passed along the tale as a cautionary legend. But in the police department, the file sat gathering dust on a shelf, one cold case among many. For the Walker family, though, it was never just another case. They lived every day in the shadow of unanswered questions. Carla's parents, Charles and Doris, would sit in their home surrounded by her photographs, her trophies, her mementos from school dances, and wonder who had taken her future away. Her younger siblings grew up with a hole in their family that could never be filled. And Rodney McCoy, the boyfriend who had been with her that night, carried a survivor's guilt that no teenager should ever have to bear. Every few years, the family would receive word that the case had been reopened, that detectives were taking another look. And every time, hope would rise, only to crash down again when nothing came of it. The 1980s brought new technologies, fingerprint databases, rudimentary DNA analysis. But for Carla's case, the breakthroughs came too slowly. Samples degraded, evidence was limited, and testing wasn't yet precise enough to deliver answers. Detectives who inherited the case from their predecessors found themselves chasing shadows. Each generation of investigators hoped to be the one to bring closure, only to find the trail colder than before. By the 1990s, the Walker family had heard it all, that the killer had to be local, that he had to be someone they'd interviewed, that the truth was buried in the early files. But speculation couldn't put a man behind bars. Despite the silence, despite the decades slipping away, Carla Walker's case never fully disappeared. Retired officers would mention it in interviews. Local papers would run anniversary stories. True crime enthusiasts and amateur sleuths traded theories. And within the Fort Worth Police Department, the file was like a stone in a shoe, always there, always nagging. Carla had been the kind of victim who demanded justice, a bright young girl with her whole life ahead of her. Detectives couldn't bear the thought of her killer escaping into obscurity. But year after year, the answer remained out of reach. Looking back, it's easy to wonder how a man like McCurley, interviewed in the first days of the investigation, could have slipped through the cracks. But in 1974, investigators were constrained. Without DNA, without surveillance cameras, without digital footprints, cases relied on tangible evidence, fingerprints, ballistics, eyewitnesses. McCurley had offered an explanation for his missing gun. There was no physical evidence tying him to Carla, and he wasn't an obvious monster. He was quiet, married, unremarkable. In a city full of suspects, he was just another face. The truth is, Carla's case stalled because science hadn't caught up yet. The answers were there, locked inside the evidence collected in 1974, but the key to unlocking them wouldn't exist for decades. For nearly half a century, the murder of Carla Walker sat frozen in time. The case had haunted the Fort Worth Police Department since 1974, a wound in the city's memory that never fully healed. Generations of detectives had tried and failed. Families had aged, parents had died, friends had grown old. But Carla's case remained unresolved, locked away in a box of files and evidence that seemed destined to gather dust forever. Then came 2019. A new team of detectives, Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett, made the decision that would finally shift the course of history. Cold case squads are often stretched thin, balancing dozens of forgotten files, but Carla's story carried a weight all its own. It wasn't just another unsolved murder. It was a case that had defined Fort Worth's darkest chapter. Both Wagner and Bennett felt it deserved one last push. So they pulled the old boxes. They combed through brittle pages of interviews typed on yellowing paper. They studied the photographs, Rodney McCoy's bloodied face, the culvert at Benbrook Lake, Carla's belongings. And buried in the evidence, they found what might be the key: her clothing, preserved since 1974. In a different era, those garments had yielded nothing. But science had changed. In the late 2010s, forensic genetic genealogy had exploded onto the crime-solving scene. It was the very same technique that cracked the infamous Golden State Killer case in California, solving a 40-year mystery. Instead of looking only for direct DNA matches in criminal databases, this new science compared crime scene DNA to consumer genealogy databases, places where millions of ordinary people had uploaded their DNA results from companies like Ancestry or 23andMe. By finding partial matches to distant relatives, scientists could build family trees that eventually narrowed to a single suspect. The detectives partnered with Othram, a state-of-the-art lab based in the Woodlands, Texas, specializing in exactly this kind of work. Othram's scientists took the degraded DNA samples from Carla's clothing and began the painstaking process of extracting a profile. It wasn't quick, it wasn't easy, but when the results came back, everything changed. The DNA pointed to one man, Glen Samuel McCurley, the same man investigators had sat across from in 1974. The man who had been questioned and dismissed nearly 50 years before. For detectives Wagner and Bennett, it was a surreal discovery. McCurley's name was right there in the old case files, an interview buried among dozens, a note about his missing .2 pistol, a detail that had gone nowhere. Now, DNA was saying what investigators couldn't prove in 1974. McCurley had been with Carla that night. But suspicion wasn't enough. DNA results from genealogy needed to be confirmed in court-admissible ways. The detectives had to move carefully. McCurley was in his late 70s, living quietly in Fort Worth, a man who had built decades of normal life while Carla's family grieved. To arrest him, police needed fresh DNA, collected directly from him. So, they went covert. In early September 2020, surveillance was set up outside McCurley's modest Fort Worth home. Detectives watched him, his routines, the quiet life of a man who had once committed a crime so violent it still echoed nearly half a century later. One night, McCurley put his trash out. That was all they needed. Investigators moved in, carefully collecting the discarded items. Inside were traces of his DNA, items ordinary people never think twice about leaving behind. The samples were rushed to the lab, and when the results came back, the answer was undeniable. The DNA from the trash matched the DNA from Carla's clothing, but detectives wanted to be certain, to leave no room for doubt. On September 21, 2020, nearly 46 years after Carla Walker's murder, detectives knocked on the door of a small Fort Worth house. Inside, an elderly man answered. His name was Glen Samuel McCurley. He was calm, polite, even grandfatherly in appearance. But detectives asked him for something that changed everything: a DNA swab. Perhaps knowing the net was already around him, McCurley consented. He let them take the swab from inside his cheek. The wait for results was excruciating, but when they came back, there was no question. The swab was a perfect match to the DNA recovered from Carla Walker's body. The case that had stood cold for nearly half a century was now burning hot. That same day, McCurley was arrested. The image of him being led away in handcuffs was almost surreal. An old man who had hidden in plain sight, now exposed as the predator who had shattered Carla's life and destroyed her family. For Fort Worth, the news broke like thunder. People who remembered 1974, who had whispered about Carla's case for decades, suddenly had an answer. Parents who had once feared for their daughters now knew the face of the man responsible. And for the Walker family, though the grief never truly ended, there was finally a name, a confession of identity, a man to face in court. The arrest hit the community hard. On one hand, there was relief, the sense that a shadow had finally been lifted. But on the other, there was shock. For 46 years, McCurley had lived as a free man, blending into the fabric of Fort Worth. Neighbors were stunned. To them, he had seemed like any other older resident, quiet, ordinary, harmless. But beneath that exterior had been the darkest of secrets. For detectives Wagner and Bennett, the breakthrough was both triumph and tragedy. Triumph because Carla's killer had finally been identified. Tragedy because it had taken so long, nearly an entire lifetime, for justice to arrive. The arrest of McCurley proved something more profound than just the closure of one case. It proved that even the coldest cases could still burn hot when touched by new science. That technology could give voices back to the voiceless. That evidence collected in 1974, preserved for nearly 50 years, could finally speak in 2020. By the summer of 2021, nearly half a century after Carla Walker's murder, the case that had haunted Fort Worth was finally heading to court. The man once dismissed in 1974 for lack of evidence, Glen Samuel McCurley, was now in shackles, indicted for capital murder. The courtroom was packed when the trial began. Reporters filled the benches. Survivors of the 1970s still clutched yellowed newspapers, and Carla's family, now older, visibly worn from decades of grief, sat silently in the front row. Their faces carried the weight of 47 years of waiting. McCurley entered the courtroom slowly, an elderly man with thinning hair, a frail body, and a face that betrayed little emotion. For many, it was surreal. This was not the shadowy predator described in police reports from 1974. This was someone's grandfather. Yet beneath the years, the jurors knew, sat the man who had stolen Carla's life. The prosecution laid out the case with methodical precision. They walked the jury through the night of February 17, 1974, painting the picture of Carla's abduction, the brutal assault, and her final moments. They displayed photographs of the crime scene, the culvert near Benbrook Lake, the clothing fibers, and, most importantly, the DNA evidence. The turning point came when experts from Othram, the Advanced Genetic Genealogy Lab, took the stand. They explained how microscopic traces of DNA left on Carla's clothing had been analyzed, broken down, and cross-referenced with public genealogy databases. That DNA had led to a family tree, and every branch pointed back to one man, Glen Samuel McCurley. The courtroom was silent when prosecutors explained how detectives had gathered fresh DNA from McCurley's trash, and later from a cheek swab he provided under surveillance. The match was undeniable. Science had caught up with him. But just as the public prepared for a long, drawn-out trial, an unexpected twist came. On August 24, 2021, as proceedings were underway, McCurley stunned the courtroom by pleading guilty to Carla Walker's murder. Gasps rippled through the audience. After decades of denial, the truth was finally spoken aloud by the man himself. The plea meant there would be no extended trial, no appeals dragged out for years. Instead, McCurley was immediately sentenced to life in prison without parole. Carla's family had agreed with prosecutors not to seek the death penalty. For them, the priority wasn't execution. It was answers, closure, and finally putting Carla's memory to rest without reliving every gruesome detail in a prolonged trial. When the judge asked if the family had a statement, Carla's relatives stood together. Her brother, Jim Walker, spoke with a voice that trembled but carried decades of suppressed pain. He described Carla as more than a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a young woman who deserved to live out her dreams. He thanked the detectives who never gave up and the scientists who turned fragments of evidence into justice. McCurley sat silently, eyes cast downward. He offered no apology, no explanation. To many, his silence was as chilling as the crime itself. For the family, the guilty plea was bittersweet. Justice had finally come, but it had taken a lifetime. Carla's parents never lived to see the day. They had gone to their graves without knowing who had murdered their daughter. That truth stung even as the verdict was handed down. Outside the courthouse, cameras captured the moment Carla's surviving relatives embraced one another. For the first time in nearly 50 years, they could speak of her case in the past tense, knowing the man responsible would never walk free again. The trial may have ended, but the impact reverberated across Texas and beyond. Legal experts called it a landmark in the use of forensic genealogy. Police departments around the country studied the case as proof that no crime, no matter how cold, was beyond the reach of modern science. For Fort Worth, the guilty plea closed one of the darkest chapters in the city's history. And for Carla Walker, forever 17, the conviction ensured that her story would not just be one of tragedy, but also of perseverance, justice, and the unshakable determination of those who refused to forget her. On July 14, 2023, less than 2 years after his guilty plea, Glen Samuel McCurley died inside a Texas state prison. There was no public spectacle, no dramatic final words. His death was quiet, almost anticlimactic compared to the decades of darkness his actions had cast over Fort Worth. For Carla Walker's family, it was one more ending in a story defined by loss. Some felt relief, others emptiness, because even with McCurley gone, Carla was not coming back. Yet in another way, Carla's name had never been more alive. Her case had transformed from a tragedy frozen in 1974 into a landmark moment in modern forensic science. The very techniques that unmasked McCurley, forensic genealogy and advanced DNA tracing, were now being hailed across the country as the future of cold case investigations. Detectives who once admitted defeat now had proof that justice could arrive decades later, carried on the tip of a cotton swab, preserved in the smallest fragment of evidence. Law enforcement agencies nationwide began re-examining dusty case files, inspired by what Carla's case had achieved. In 2025, her story went from courtroom headlines to the halls of Congress. Lawmakers introduced a proposal called the Carla Walker Act. The bill sought to provide federal funding for DNA genealogy testing in unsolved crimes, ensuring that other families would not have to wait half a century for answers. The act symbolized something larger, a recognition that Carla's life, though stolen, had ignited a national movement for justice. For Carla's surviving family, it was bittersweet. They had lived with unanswered questions for so long that the silence had become part of their lives. Now, those decades of suffering carried a new weight. Their sister's death might save countless others from the same fate by giving investigators the tools to catch killers hiding in plain sight. Communities across America began seeing results. Murders from the 1980s, even the 1960s, were being cracked open with DNA genealogy. Each time a cold case made headlines, Carla's name was often invoked. She had become a symbol, proof that time does not erase guilt, that science can catch what human memory cannot. But with that progress came an emotional undertone that never left Fort Worth. For the friends who danced beside Carla the night she was abducted, For the classmates who remembered her laughter in the halls of Western Hills High, the story was always personal. She wasn't just a case file or a courtroom headline. She was a girl with dreams who should have grown old, raised children, and lived a life. The legacy of Carla Walker now rests in two stark truths: the horror of her final hours and the hope that grew from the justice she finally received. Her story is retold not only to remember the cruelty she endured, but to show that persistence, science, and determination can bridge even the longest gap between crime and conviction. And so, nearly 50 years after that night in February 1974, Carla Walker's name continues to echo, no longer only as the victim of one of Fort Worth's darkest crimes, but as the spark that changed how America fights for justice. True crime is not just about the horror of what happened, but the lessons we take away. If you believe Carla Walker's name should never be forgotten, hit the like button and share this video so more people hear her story.